out for on this front. Of course, we'll be getting more clarity around this when the PM, as promised, once again, he said that he will be announcing this from the Red Fort in the future in terms of how this GST simplification could be coming about by Diwali. And lots to talk about on this front. Let's decode the impact of this announcement, what it could potentially mean for the everyday life, the everyday expenses of the common man, and how the rate rationalization could play out going ahead. To discuss the same, we have Gaura Gupta, Chief Economist at IDFC First Bank, joining us on the show. Gaura, hi, and always a pleasure speaking to you. Give us a sense of what you're making of this announcement that's just come by this morning in terms of the rate rationalization that could happen going ahead. My colleague Prakash just a few minutes ago was highlighting the potential slabs clubbing we could see, an introduction of a 15% slab potentially. Give us your first thoughts on this.
So this GST rationalization has been in the works for some time now. I think a couple of months back, even the FM, Nirmala Sitharaman, had indicated that the revenue neutral rate, the rate at which basically the center is able to ensure that the states are not losing revenue because of their entry into the GST framework. The fact that certain state level taxes got subsumed within the GST framework, that revenue neutral rate has actually come down. And a couple of months back, there was an indication that gives the center, and this will be GST, so it's going to be a joint endeavor between center and states, because there is a large share of indirect taxes both at center and state level, which have got subsumed. So the GST Council together will have to make the decision. But there is space, as per the earlier statement, to reduce the rates and rationalize it. So as your colleague earlier pointed out, you could see clubbing of the earlier 12% and the 18% in a sort of a medium or a mean rate can be put in. So instead of having 4 or 5 GST rates, you can have a more consolidated structure. Globally, GST, or you say, if you look at the VAT rate system in other markets, developed markets, it tends to be one particular rate only. It's not a tiered system. But for India, given the fact that from an implementation perspective, and given the fact that GST covers the gambit of goods and services, it covers not just luxury, it also covers essential items. So to move directly from a multiple tax rates that we had at center and state levels into a flat one rate is very difficult. So the government took a very pragmatic approach, and you got a sort of a more consolidated 5, including the zero tax slab under GST. And now they're going to move to the next phase, which is to consolidate this from the 5 rate structure to something lesser. And hopefully we get some sort of a relief in terms of lower rates on certain essential consumption items, which is important because right now the union budget did provide us a boost on the direct tax collection front. We got a large substantial cut in income tax, but the reach of income tax is very limited because it's only limited to the people who actually pay positive income tax, which is a very small share. While indirect taxes like GST have a very large reach. So any fiscal space that the center is able to provide in terms of lower tax rates on essential items might help to provide some impetus to, let's say, the urban consumption side, which has not been doing so well. So, but since we don't know the details yet, but yes, it's good from a growth perspective that we are getting another, after the direct tax, we are getting now, hopefully, an income tax push also for consumption, indirect tax push for consumption.
Right. Gaurav, this is Jude here. Very quickly, since you spoke about how the resultant outcome of rate rationalization would essentially, hopefully, mean fewer taxes for Indian consumers, and given that indirect taxes occupy such a large percentage of Indian tax collection, from an economic standpoint, what do you think the government's approach would be to, yes, rationalize rates, yes, hopefully result in lesser tax slabs or lesser tax rates that we will end up paying by way of GST, but to also ensure a steady pace of tax collection? What do you think the strategy to achieve that balance from the government side would end up being?
They have a very tricky situation, to be honest. I mean, the center is trying its level best to give sort of a push to growth. Especially we are in FY26. The challenges that the center that is going to face is the fact that we have a rapid slowdown in inflation. Both you look at CPI inflation, 8-year low. You look at WPI inflation. We've got two prints which are negative. So it means that all your nominal tax revenue measures will tend to slow down. One, because of inflation. Two, the fact that the formal side of the economy, while growth is stable, it is still softening. For example, if you look at the latest number that we got from the Ministry of Finance on direct tax collections, corporate tax, income tax, you'll see that they are much weaker than expected. And this is almost for the first half. This is from April to August 11th. And so that is a challenge, how they are able to rationalize GST and ensure that there is no revenue hit. Because on the fisc side, while they've got some fiscal space because of the larger than expected RBI dividend, the government had earlier also increased excise duty on petrol and diesel. The issue that they are facing is when you have an inflation slowdown, when you have a nominal GDP slowdown. So, for example, this year we expect nominal GDP at around 8 to 8.5. Budget is working with a 10%, and this is because of inflation slowing down and growth holding at around 6.3% in real terms. So for them to find space to give a reasonable cut in GST and maintain fiscal prudence, I think is going to be challenging. What we will see is certain essential items which were at the 5% sort of tax slab or the lower tax slabs, essential items like food, etc. They're likely to not get touched, or maybe we'll get a sort of a cut. Maybe we'll see a wider net to compensate for the revenue impact. Maybe we'll see a sort of a wider net at the luxury end of the consumption spectrum, because that is still doing really well. So they'll have to balance the need for simplification, the need for fiscal consolidation, and the fact that the urban side of the economy requires support. So it's going to be a delicate balancing act from a fiscal perspective.
Sure. Appreciate that view. We also have Mitali Nikore, founder and economist at Nikore Associates, joining us on the show. Mitali, hi, and thanks for your time. A couple of questions on this GST announcement front. Now, we've understood, or we might have a rough idea of what could potentially play out. But the question is, why now? Do you think this is to combat the tariff impact that we have seen? Why not wait till the budget to announce something on the GST front? And why do it during Diwali, when the festive season is expected to anyway give a boost to consumption? Why add one more bazooka to that at that time? If you could help us understand the timing of this.
No, absolutely, Snehi. Thanks a lot for bringing me on the show. I think today the Prime Minister has actually made a number of announcements, around the theme of Viksit Bharat and Nyay Bharat, which go far beyond just the GST. So, the fact that there's a national task force being set up to understand the vision of Viksit Bharat is a very critical announcement. Then, second, we see that, even the PM Viksit Bharat Rozgar Yojana has been announced, which allocates nearly 1 lakh crores for employment generation amongst the youth. And then we are also seeing that the Prime Minister repeatedly, talking about the fact that we need to make in India, become self-reliant, also talking about the theme of energy independence, which he has not touched on so many times before. I think all of this ties in to the idea that the entire GST regime, it should not hold back innovation, it should not hold back the entire make in India dream. And it has been constantly criticized, always sort of brought into that point that, it is actually the GST regime which is deterring people from innovation, which is deterring people from setting up their units in India. So therefore I think the announcement of the GST simplification ties in very clearly to the broader economic objectives, and which is where he also brought in the points around semiconductors and the fact that India will now be targeting to launch its own semiconductor factories and its own semiconductor production by the end of 2025. These messages are all tied in to the entire notion that of making in India, of self-reliance, and not being dependent on imports from any country and the regimes that are operating outside of India.
Right. Mitali, I'm also just wondering, while there's been so much talk about GST rationalization, fewer rates, lesser rates, and, like the Prime Minister said, a bonanza to Indian consumers, do you feel the government might run into a roadblock or two when it comes to getting all the states in the GST Council on board with regard to rate rationalization? I know the discussion has been happening for quite a while now. It's been on the anvil. But insofar as to go about rationalizing and rationalizing these rates and allowing for fewer and lesser rates across the board, do you feel getting all states, especially heavy consumption states, on board, do you feel there might be challenges to achieving that end?
No, actually, at this point in time, I think even in the last GST Council meeting, we were expecting some amount of rate rationalization. And the discussions around rationalization have been happening for the last 3 to 4 meetings, actually, of the different councils that have been constituted. So I think at this point in time, the states are expecting some amount of movement towards rationalization. I don't expect that to be as much of a challenge in this round. Also, at this point in time, the states are also aware that a lot of the investments, especially foreign direct investments that were expected, particularly in industrial corridor projects, particularly in manufacturing projects supported by the PLI scheme, may or may not pan out in the same way, because the global economy today is not the global economy when the production linked incentive scheme, for example, was announced. And today, there is much more of a reliance on domestic investment driving forward India's manufacturing ambitions. And in order for that to be successful, the GST rationalization becomes a necessary condition. I think, in some of the announcements today, it was again very evident, especially when we look at the announcements around the national critical mission, which has been announced around the defense equipment, and the fact that Prime Minister highlighting that we don't need to be dependent on other countries for manufacturing our defense equipment going forward. I mean, this is also going to be an area where the government themselves, the central government themselves, goes to states and says, we are going to invest in expanding defense manufacturing capacity. And I've seen how, in states like West Bengal and states like, in the south, in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, we often find large numbers of MSMEs involved in defense manufacturing. And for them, again, a predictable, simplified GST regime is the need of the hour. So I think the Viksit Bharat task force on the top, trickling down then to the GST reforms, it makes complete sense for a true economic overhaul in the Indian
Right.
economy.
Right, absolutely. So that's the color. That's the entire color on the rationale behind these announcements that we're hearing. Gaura and Mitali, stay on with us as we welcome on board Mr. Rajiv Kumar, former Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog of India. Mr. Kumar, thanks so much for your time today, and thanks for speaking to us at ED Now. Give us your first take on the policies that we've heard over the course of this speak. Lots to do with public policy. Give us a sense of what objectives are being fulfilled here, especially on the GST front, how that could pan out from a whole public policy benefit point of view.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And first and foremost, happy Independence Day to all of you. I really like the fact that the Prime Minister focused on the necessity for further reforms and making the domestic economy as competitive as possible, because that's the only way forward in meeting the challenges now being posed to us with the fragmented and changing world economy. And just before I come to the GST, the task force that he's defined on, that he has announced on reforms up to 2047, I think that's a great move forward. But also it'll have to be, the task force has its work cut out, and the first thing that they should do is to define what they mean by Viksit Bharat. So that will then determine the rest of it. On the GST, I think it's high time that we have another grand bargain with the states, and grand bargain in the sense that we now need to convince them to bring the fuel, the petrol and diesel within the realm of GST, because otherwise, nobody gets the credit for using raises costs and makes our industries more, less competitive. In fact, the other thing which is not in the GST law, but which needs looking at is inclusion of the alcoholic drinks, in the excise duty, as it were. Because if that was the case, then all of this will be sorted out, and GST will become, a simpler phenomena. The point is to, apart from the grand bargain, you have to simplify the GST process. Now it becomes so complicated, the 5 rates, and within each category, the sort of, the minutiae that have been introduced, it has become a kind of a regulatory burden. And large number of, the majority of our SMEs are not able to afford the chartered accountants required to fulfill the GST requirements. So you remember the original objective was to have a single GST rate, and now we have 5 if you include 0. And I think this time it will be best if you can come back to 2, a 0, which is for essential commodities, and then 1, somewhere between 15 or along that, so that the whole thing can be so simplified that nobody has, nobody faces the problem of, meeting the GST requirements. So I think it's now time. And the third thing that you have to do is to now absorb the concession, the cess of 28% that the central government imposes to be able to hand over to the states which are losing out. And I think that time has passed. We've had the COVID plus extension, and now the cess should be eliminated as well. I think all of that requires, a significant move by the GST Council, but it's time that we did it.
Take coming in on the rationale behind this, Gaura, I just want to understand from you from an economic point of view. Okay, this first up, we've heard the budget tax limit extension to 12 lakh rupees crores. That's one boost to the taxpayer. Secondly, not this policy, but the one before that, the MPC announcement that came of the rate cut by 50 bips, another boost to liquidity. Now we have a third flip coming in wherein GST rates are potentially going to either be reduced or clubbed, that could potentially, maybe to whatever little extent, boost further liquidity. Do you think all of this liquidity in the system may actually lead to something that we are not looking forward to? This could perhaps become a case of excess liquidity in the system.
So, the RBI liquidity boost that they've given, it's coming to the banking system. It's not coming to the consumer. So what RBI has done, essentially, they bought 5 trillion of bonds from banks, and in turn, banks got liquidity. So the aim of that was that, there would be a pickup in the bank. There would be some support to the bank credit cycle, which for now is still, I would say, on a path of moderation. It takes some time for all the easing of rate cuts and the substantial infusion of liquidity to actually show up, the impact to show up on bank credit. We are seeing some support in terms of deposits. So so they are trying to ensure that the credit channel does not slow down further, and there is some sort of pickup. So growth is not negatively impacted. Now, what the government is doing, the government has the ability, the RBI is able to reach the consumer via the rate cuts. So the 100 basis point cuts, that's really helped the consumer in terms of especially the floating rate loans, the home loans. If once it get automatically transmitted, so the EMI cost comes down a bit. But the real ability of the fiscal side is to reach the consumer and is to boost demand. Either you do it via tax cuts or you do it via expansion in expenditure, especially capital expenditure. Now, definitely, if you look at fiscal multipliers, the indirect tax, depending on how they manage to structure the GST rates, how much of a rate cut they are able to give, because you have to keep in mind they have to take on board states. This is a collaborative. GST is a collaboration between center and state. So the center will have to convince state governments to agree to this rationalization. And for states also, they are also facing a situation where you have a slowdown in terms of nominal numbers because inflation has fallen. So their tax collections also get impacted. There's also another part which is impacting state government fiscal, is that the center's reform of just-in-time cash management, which is a good reform and a reform that is going to continue to be further enhanced and expanded, has saved a lot of idle fund transfers from the center to states. So basically, they will not transfer funds to states unless states have used the past funds for the intended scheme, let's say. So what that has done is that if you look at the grants from center to states, they have been slowing down for the last couple of years. Now this is a just-in-time cash management reform. It is an essential reform, and its application is going to just expand going forward. So what is happening is you're seeing states coming more to the market. They are issuing more bonds to fund their own fiscal deficits. So that is the framework within which the center will have to convince states to reduce to agree to a lower level of GST rate. So it's a very delicate balancing act which the center will have to conduct. In terms of, is it too much? I would say no. I think it is required. For now, we've got exceptional support from the Reserve Bank of India. They have done rate cuts, liquidity infusion. We also require a demand side push, which only the fiscal can provide. And our fiscal has been very well, has been the focus has been a lot on fiscal discipline. So this we've got one direct tax collection, but the impact is limited by the fact that very a small proportion of the population actually pays a positive income tax. If you look at the tax filing data, indirect tax cut, if depending on how they structure it, it will have a much wider reach and it will give some boost to consumption, which is really required because right now, if you look at company commentary, the urban side, the urban demand is not doing as well. So, this sort of a cut in GST rates, if provided does not have too much of a negative impact on fiscal metrics, I think would be is essential. I would not say it's excessive.
Okay, so that's the take on that front. But while we have spoken about macros and the economy, let's zoom in a little bit and talk about the market impact or the sectoral impact that we are gauging from the Prime Minister's speech. Now, lots of sectors that he spoke about, and he spoke about aims and goals going ahead on defense, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals. Let's understand how all of these will come into play. He spoke about Operation Sindoor and the need to be independent when it comes to our fighter jets. So something like an HAL or any other defense counter could be in focus on the back of this. You also have chip manufacturing because now we have announced 4 facilities for that. Made in India, made for India, made by India is the theme when it comes to semiconductors. So watch out for a couple of names like Dixon, HCL. Mission hydrogen is the next theme that he touched upon. So green energy could be the sector in focus going ahead, and GAIL, Reliance, these could potentially be the big players there. He also spoke about national critical minerals mission and deep exploration. So this could be positive for autos, particularly the ones that are in the EV space for the rare earth minerals, that the exploration is underway in more than 1,200 regions. So names like Tata Motors, M&M could be in focus. He also said, he spoke about space. India is working towards making its own space station. Couple stocks in focus on this. He also spoke about tech, vaccines, low-cost medication. So all your pharma players with a generic exposure to domestics would be very important to watch out for. Of course, IT, fertilizers, chemicals, all of this he spoke for. Most importantly, the whole Diwali Dhamaka GST announcement that we were talking about, and some of the sectors that are getting taxed at 28%, be it consumer durables, smaller cars, cigarette and aerated drinks. You have your consumer staples that are at 18% at present. All of these could be in focus based on what announcements we see going ahead. And lastly, also the Pradhan Mantri Viksit Bharat Rozgar Yojana that would need increased staffing. So a couple of names like team leads, for instance, that are into the staffing space could be in focus. But that's just a generic take right now as we await more clarity on all of these announcements.